The LGBT community is just, what's happened to them is just so sad. And to be thinking about where their policies are currently with this administration is a disgrace to that community, I will tell you right now. Clinton wants to allow radical Islamic terrorists to pour into our country. They enslave women and they murder gays. I don't want them in our country. Ask yourself, who is really the friend of women and the LB and LGBT community? Donald Trump with actions or Hillary Clinton with her words?
That was Donald Trump before the 2016 election and right after the Pulse nightclub shooting, in which Trump was trying to present himself as the pro-gay candidate as opposed to Hillary Clinton, which is something we'll take up a little bit later. This is the Disco Donald edition of the Political Junkie podcast. I'm Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil Young.
And we're here to talk about everything gay in the Trump administration. But we're going to start, as we always do, with the news. For the past week, California Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom has trolled President Donald J. Trump with tweets, memes, and AI-generated videos that mimic MAGA world's worship of him as a sacred figure, a pop culture icon, and a superhero. Newsom has been getting attention for this, but also getting out information. For example, that red state murder rates are higher than those in blue states. He's also spoofing MAGA with a so-called Patriot Shop that has made, I kid you not, Neil, $300,000 since Monday, selling merch that says things like, "Make America Gavin Again." Is it a coincidence that he has also surged 8 points in the polls and is currently the leading Democratic candidate for 2026? Now, or 2028, excuse me. Now, Neil, it's much too early for us to really start calling it for presidential candidates. But do you think Newsom is really on to something with all of this crazy stuff?
I do. I mean, first of all, just that spike in his numbers is not a bad move at this point if you're gaming out, a 3-year campaign for 2028. I mean, a lot of this is just, I think the numbers going up is probably a lot of it is just based on name recognition. Often those of us who watch politics closely forget how many Americans don't. And so name recognition and visibility does a huge a task in sort of improving people's polling numbers. And I think that's what's happening a lot here. I also think we can sort of discuss what we think about this tactic and like how we feel about sort of Newsom trumping himself. Although I don't think that this is all that distant from sort of who he is as a person and a politician. Although I think he's probably leaning into it a lot more just given the Trump of it all. But how do you feel about this?
Well, I'm mixed. I agree with you that name recognition is everything. I mean, it was sort of astonishing before the last election. There were all kinds of people walking into the voting booth actually having no idea who Donald Trump and Kamala Harris were, which astonishes me. I think you really have to work hard to avoid elections nowadays. However, I think that Newsom is not responding to something that young Democrats and many Democrats certainly want, which is some kind of program. What do Democrats stand for? On the other hand, he can't do that by himself. I mean, we really need the party to coalesce around a message. So in the absence of that, Newsom putting himself out there in a way that's funny, cute, tacky, emphasizes two things, one of which is he's younger than Donald Trump. The other is he's handsomer than Donald Trump. And the other is he is both younger and he may not be younger than J.D. Vance, but he's certainly a heck of a lot better looking and he has a sense of humor.
Definitely. I agree with all that. I also just we're historians here, so I want to sort of make a little bit of a historical argument or just sort of flag what I see as a real change here that's worth noting, which is like we have definitely turned the corner from something that wasn't all that long ago, which was sort of the Michelle Obama era of politics, where it was when they go low, we go high, right? That was the 2015, 2016 message to respond to the first Trump moment. It feels like that one is no longer the case, or if it is, Newsom's certainly not going to be the one to take that as an approach for his campaign strategy.
Well, yeah. And really, who's surprised? I mean, I admired Michelle Obama for taking that approach, but how many of us heard our mothers say to us, don't worry about that bully in the playground, dear, just walk away and everybody will like you for it. And in fact, everybody didn't like you for it. Everybody thought you were just like a big pussy for handling it that way. So I think if they go low, we go low. Might as well try it. Okay.
I don't like it,
So
but I think you're right.
yeah. All right. So our second item here is that MAGA World went into a tailspin this week. I couldn't even believe it when I saw this was happening. When the iconic right-wing Cracker Barrel restaurant chain unveiled its corporate redesign, there was a new logo and decorating scheme and menu items like margaritas that apparently Cracker Barrel people think are too female. What upset people most is that this figure known as the old timer, or sometimes as old Uncle Herschel, who is this old guy sitting next to the barrel with his elbow up in the barrel, who I suppose harkens back to the good old days in the South where the Ku Klux Klan hung out in restaurants and so on before they went and hurt people, that person was removed. Now, what the MAGA people are saying is that the national chain had abandoned its old fashioned charm. Donald Trump jumped in to say that Cracker Barrel should put everything back the way it was. And as of late yesterday, they actually did that. Now, there's one other thing that I think our audience should know, which is the chain has been on the brink of bankruptcy for a really long time. And this is what this redesign, I believe, was aimed at, to sort of create a larger customer base. So all the people who love Cracker Barrel don't seem to be supporting it very well. Are they, Neil?
That's right, or there's just not enough of them anymore. I mean, what they had said was our audience is only older generation. They're probably not coming as much. They took a huge hit during COVID, as many places did, but haven't rebounded from that because I think they're so attached to a particular generation. And this was their attempt to reach new folks and new clients, and particularly people of a younger age. So I don't care about the trademark or the logo sign. I mean, I don't care about any of this really, but like, did you see the way that they've sort of reimagined the inside of the restaurants? It's
Right.
It's truly horrible. But
Yeah.
like, this is also just the type of restaurant I wouldn't normally choose to go to begin with. And it doesn't seem all that radical or woke to me that it just thought, okay, our infrastructures need a bit of an update. This is the normal thing any business does to stay current and fresh. This is so perceived as like holding these nostalgic symbols and meanings that are obviously very fraught in our political culture. And it was a huge opportunity for white Americans to sort of engage grievance politics. And yeah, so they're back to the old logo. They've gotten a ton of free press this week. But the question remains, are people actually going to go to this place and order lots of fried food when that's not what really most Americans eat anymore?
Right. Well, and let me say, I haven't gone to Cracker Barrel in years. I rarely did anyway. I mean, they're by the side of the road all over the place. But there was a big boycott of Cracker Barrel when they announced a policy that said that all of their employees basically had to be straight. They didn't come out and say you couldn't be gay because that would have been breaking the law, but that you had to reflect the family values of the chain. They seem to have backed off of that, although I continued to remember it and continued not going to Cracker Barrel because of it, which I think is kind of a sign that once these things get in the public mind, they really stick. I think the other thing that I'm looking at is there is a kind of limited, and as you're saying, shrinking audience for the kind of nostalgia that MAGA is selling, that Donald Trump is selling. And so you have to wonder whether this is some kind of a metaphor for the direction of the GOP. I mean, I don't want to take it too seriously, but the sort of burst of outrage. At first, I thought they were just trying to knock Epstein off Twitter. And then I saw people were really serious. The other thing I started thinking about was that article, or the collection of articles that Eric Hobsbawm did years ago called The Invention of Tradition, because people kept talking about Cracker Barrel as traditional and old fashioned and so on. It was invented in 1979.
Mhm.
And so that caused me to think, it's interesting. 1979 is when the effects of the civil rights movement have actually kind of solidified. And yes, Ronald Reagan gets elected the next year, but the sort of latching on to Cracker Barrel, which is Southern, as something traditional that is of value to our culture strikes me as in keeping with MAGA's white supremacist politics.
Yeah, and I think that's so smart. And just in terms of the symbology and sort of the shrinking audience for it, just to tie it back to the Newsom conversation, if this guy is going to sort of take the meme heavy path to his political future, it does seem like there's an opportunity for the left, or at least for folks like Gavin Newsom, to develop a sort of nostalgia tinged symbology that works for actually a broader audience, one that's obviously directed towards Democrats, but that has appeal kind of across a partisan divide, that also might be much more generationally fresh, and but still ties into people's sense of nostalgia and tradition, but one that is probably not as niche as this one we see sort of waning with Cracker Barrel and the like.
Right. And it's also of a piece, of course, with Trump's urging the Washington Commanders to change their name back to the old racist name that they had for many, many years. And that, of course, is very, very active on right-wing Twitter. And the sort of sense that someone wrote the other day, who I was in conversation with about this, said, Native Americans are part of our common past. And I was like, no, they are not part of your common past or my common past. They are part of a Native American past. And so this return to a time when you could simply extract symbols from their historical context and rewrite them or reuse them for a contemporary purpose seems to be where MAGA is at. And it seems like a very fragile place to be nowadays. So let's talk about another kind of nostalgia. One of my favorite / least favorite restaurant chains ever, Hooters, which actually did file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy last spring and closed 30 locations in Florida and California, may be in for a renaissance. Attorney Neil Kiefer, who owns 24 franchises and sees the second Trump administration as a great opportunity to market a tacky aesthetic. He actually said that, says he wants to, quote, re-Hooterize the chain. This apparently means butter on everything and slightly longer shorts for the all-female waitstaff. He said their cheeks should not be hanging out of the shorts. And they will also be no longer instructed to do everything short of a pole dance to get a tip. The new business plan will emphasize a wholesome nostalgia for scantily clad women. Isn't that great?
Amazing.
But they're also covered, and they're not apparently crossing some line that I'm unaware of. Neil, do we need Hooters to come back to America to make it great again?
I don't think so, but I love that he said the quiet part out loud, that literally this is a moment to lean into tackiness because of like that gold covered, monster in the White House. Like this is a moment for tacky to come back. I found this fascinating. I've never been to a Hooters. I've been to Cracker Barrel many times, which I think is, when you grow up in a Southern family, that goes to church, you stop on the side of the highway to eat at Cracker Barrel, obviously not at Hooters. And also Hooters obviously never had appeal to me when I became an adult, because more than a mouthful is the company slogan. And, we don't have to spell this out. But I really went down a rabbit hole on the articles here and the way they were parsing what was like appropriate shorts and non-appropriate shorts. And like, as a gay guy, all of it looked like pretty scanty to me. But I love that there's a sort of scanty appropriateness and a scanty inappropriateness. And this guy, that line is clear to him.
Right.
And that there's a sort of like tasteful nostalgia one can get back to that is markedly different from the tawdry indecency that the restaurant has now.
Well, I hadn't actually thought about it in this way before you said that, Neil. But when we think about appropriate tiny shorts, I guess we need to think, Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders.
Uh-huh.
Like they are considered tasteful, or like
Right.
at least riding that line between
Yep.
tasteful and lewd. And of course, there are very strict rules for NFL cheerleaders about what they're not allowed to do, which is like practically everything that also keeps that line intact. But the other thing that I thought was interesting about these articles is nobody talks about the thing that is
The
being
food.
advertised, the Hooters, right? It's like, well, I mean, it's called Hooters for a
Right.
reason. And of course, that may be a word that nobody, my father used it from time to time, but certainly our generation, I don't think even knew that word. The only reason I know it is that my father used it, but it sort of goes in a category of like, talking about the shelf, which is how large breasted women were sometimes referred to as having a shelf and so on, and a range of euphemisms, but they don't actually talk about the Hooters at all. And, they talk about the shorts, they talk about the hula hoops and so on. The other thing that I actually thought was interesting about this, Neil, was that part of the chain's demise was that it got split in two. And one half of it was being run by private equity, and the other half was being run by franchise owners. And the private equity half apparently got weirder and weirder. So this guy is eliminating all of that. Anyway, we will see if Hooters returns to our country to make America great again. We have one more news item that I just want to throw in because it's actual politics. Today, we learned that bright red Iowa no longer has a Republican supermajority in the state legislature. Democrat Caitlin Dry appears to have defeated Republican Christopher Prosh by 11 points in a lean red Northwest district near Sioux City. Neil, I know we can't sort of look at these election by election results, but that a lean red Iowa district kicked out the Republicans, is that something we should be paying attention to?
By an 11-point margin. I hadn't heard I just saw the news, but I hadn't seen what the results were. So I think that's like a very telling thing. Obviously, Democratic voters are keyed up and they're ready to go and to act in any opportunity they have. I think it's a question what that looks like a year plus from now when we're in a midterm election where like everyone's engaged or certainly more people are engaged. But this is not bad news.
Right.
And I think Democrats have to be really happy about this. And I would think that Republicans should be very concerned to lose what should have been a pretty safe district to them. And so certainly to lose it by those numbers.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we're also getting a little bit of information about a demographic that's hard to poll, which is agriculture. We know that American agriculture has gotten hit pretty hard this year with the Trump tariffs and other bad decisions that are being made in Washington, the removal of subsidies and so on. But, if we are seeing rural people angry about what's happening in Washington, Iowa is where it would show up. I mean, it's a very well-educated population, regardless of what you do for a living. And they're noticing, I think. All right. So, Neil, let's go back to our happy place, gay conservatives. Certainly your happy place, but it also became my happy place after I read your wonderful, wonderful book. And our focus this week is not on all gay conservatives, but those who are currently surrounding Donald Trump. It's an administration that is determined to stamp out the individual rights that the LGBT community has achieved over the last half century. And yet we also have a lot of gay men in Washington in very powerful positions that we can name because they're all out to each other and to the world, who say actually their presence in a very conservative administration is the sign that all gay rights have been achieved and nothing else needs to happen. Neil, how do we start a conversation about people who seem to be so clueless about who most LGBT people are?
Well, I'll say that, first of all, I have lots of thoughts here, having written a book about the history of this movement. And I think that the history is instructive, as always, here.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that gay Republicans were working for decades was for recognition that they belong to the party, that they were already within the party itself, and for better position within it, sort of better treatment, better visibility, and that those could be mechanisms of power. In order to advance gay rights forward, their notion of gay rights was incredibly limited, although I think it was one that was really important and did accomplish some consequential things that can be seen as true progress, but limited nonetheless. But the goal has been for sort of publicity, for visibility and presence and power within the Republican Party itself. And on those grounds, Trump has really granted it to a handful of white gay men. And this movement has really always been a movement of white gay men. So now that they're visible, now that they have sort of a direct access to Trump, now that he says sort of nice things about them and is willing to be seen alongside of them, you know, as far as they're concerned, mission accomplished. But I think what it ultimately is both a historical fulfillment of that, you know, that goal for power, access, and presence, but also what are the costs of that and what sort of consequences and what sort of things have been given up in this sort of quest for power and inclusion at the expense of what other things.
Right. Well, and it's one of the things I love so much about your book, which we link to in the post, as we do every week. But listeners might want to go and take a look at it because you begin to fill in what I think is a really big unwritten history. I mean, I remember early in the AIDS crisis when I was young and living in Manhattan and sort of peripherally knew a couple of the guys involved with the gay men's health crisis. There was one big sort of calamitous moment in which they were about to have their first fundraiser. And there was a huge fight within the group about whether to send out the invitations in plain brown envelopes or whether to send it out with the Gay Men's Health Crisis return address. And there were a great many men involved with GMHC who said, I'm not out at work. I'm not out to my family. I'm not out to my neighbors. Do not send this shit to my home. And so one of the things that I wonder is how long has there been a sort of undercurrent of maybe not very political, maybe not very arch conservative, but right-wing men who did not see their sexuality as particularly defining and saw their accomplishments, their wealth, their professional status as much more who they were. Is that history well written, Neil?
Well, I think that's a huge theme of my book, and it was a big thing that I noticed and then really realized was sort of central to the story and the argument I wanted to build. You know, I thought that my book was going to begin in the late 1970s, and that's when a handful of the first gay Republican organizations were founded almost entirely in California in response to an anti-gay initiative that was on the ballot here in 1978. And so I thought that's where the story began, right? Like these out gay men create gay Republican organizations to defeat this amendment and also to tell the Republican Party, like, hey, we're here, we belong. But as I began researching those men and sort of their biographies, I realized some of them had been this is like 1978, and I realized some of them had been involved in the Republican Party since the 1950s. And so I sort of started pulling my story back further and further and realizing there was a long history of closeted gay men from the middle of the 20th century through those decades who were instrumental to the building of the Republican Party and the modern conservative movement. And even as many of them came out and sort of showed themselves to be gay Republicans publicly, two things developed. One was a lot of them remained in the closet through the 80s, through the 90s, into the 2000s. So you have that ongoing history of the closeted gay Republican who's at the center of Republican Party politics in Washington, D.C. But even among those out gay Republicans, the sort of overwhelming identity politics that they presented was our sexuality is inconsequential. Mm-hmm. It's a secondary or even tertiary identity. The things that matter most are we're conservatives, we're Americans, we're business owners. Right. And we believe in a sort of politics where our personal lives doesn't matter. And so I think that adheres to a general sort of conservative philosophy that doesn't want to play up identity that much, even as it does engage identity politics. But all of that is to say is, I think it's sort of the conservative temperament in politics to downplay this particular identity
Right.
as central to the politics itself. Like, I'm a taxpayer first.
Right.
I'm a patriotic American first, and I want to work for a country and a party that doesn't hold this against me, but also doesn't like think that I need to talk about gay rights all the time. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And I just want to return to this paradox of not wanting to focus on identity, but the identity is pervasively there.
Absolutely.
Featured in the New York Times article we both read this week is Charles Moran, who was the president of the Log Cabin Republicans. Donald Trump has now nominated him to, he is the National Nuclear Security Chief at the Department of Energy, which strikes me as kind of a weird job because we have almost no nuclear power plants online, but whatever. And he talks a lot about the gay networks, that he has a spreadsheet. He's always discovering a new gay here and there. The article opens with Moran sort of sitting there greeting a range of people and saying, I love my straights as much as I love my gays. But he also talks about this network as a power tribe. So, of course, we know there were always gay networks in Washington that in some ways were more effective because they were undercover.
That's right.
People weren't out. But how is this power tribe functioning differently than the old power tribe?
Well, I think, the visibility of it and the sort of centrality of it to the Trump administration is really different from past administrations. And certainly if we look back a couple of decades, radically different from sort of the silent, shadowy networks that often operated like under the radar.
Right.
I do think that we see visible gay men in the Bush administration, less so in the Reagan administration, although there were a ton of gay men who were known to be in the administration, but it just wasn't public. But I think to the extent that they are sort of open and out there about who they are and their access and sort of proximity to Trump is really different. George W. Bush definitely cultivated that relationship with log cabin Republicans and gay conservatives. But, most of it was like they tried to keep it on the down low. Like you get one or two positive articles out there about it to show that you're not like a right-wing, monster, but like you don't constantly show that you're meeting with log cabin Republicans. That's really different now with Trump. Like there is a much more a sort of visible connection there. And all of this matters, of course, because of what's happening in the political realm around LGBTQ rights, right? That visibility, that proximity is significant on its own, just as a historical development, but is really significant now as in the political moment in which LGBTQ rights are so under assault by this administration.
Well, and I want to talk about this a little bit because what really stands out for me with these men is someone like Charles Moran and Scott Bessent in particular. Scott Bessent was never in the closet, as far as I can tell. One of the things he talks about is having wanted to go to a military academy. Bessent is about 4 years younger than me. And actually, we both went to Yale, which is how I tracked it. And Bessent wanted to go to a military academy, but he didn't want to lie about himself while he was there, which was a really interesting decision. The 1980s were really that moment where, yes, some people were out, but it was also very clear that it could penalize you. There were a number of professional decisions I didn't choose because I was a lesbian, one of which was the possibility of going into government. And I just thought, that's not for me. I can't be in the closet like that. So Bessent and Moran have never been in the closet, and they're not informed by the politics of the closet. So how does that then make it possible for them to perhaps navigate the homophobia of the administration differently?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because they sort of operate from, and I think it's not just about these two, but about like how they represent sort of a broader demographic here in our moment of being sort of post-closet, homosexuals.
Right.
Also, overwhelmingly, again, it should be said, white gay men. With that, sexual identity comes a ton of privilege predicated on race and gender that are, obviously have a lot of privilege in our culture in general, to say nothing of how much they're privileged in conservative circles. But I think like there's not a sort of closeted mindset or even a historical sense of the closet in the way that was, I think, the case for a lot of older gay activists, particularly those on the left, but was certainly the case for gay Republicans I was writing about in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even the early 2000s.
Yeah.
They're just operating in sort of a different cultural context and a different sort of personal biography in which I think they can really dismiss homophobia as some like silly preoccupation of a few crazy folks, but not as sort of like a system of actual culture and law that one could return to. Like they don't see the threat of homophobia as being real and of radically changing their lives.
Right.
I think they think it's more just sort of like a silly preoccupation of, you know, a handful of like the crazies.
Well, and it's interesting that I have not seen what happened to Milo Yiannopoulos happen to anyone else. And for listeners who are not tracking what that means, Yiannopoulos was, of course, the very flamboyant, very out gay Republican, really a fascist, who was taken down abruptly by a video posted to YouTube in which he talked about a relationship that he had with a priest in his youth in England and how the priest had taught him to do oral sex, and it was like a gift for the rest of his life. And Yiannopoulos was the kind of person who was always saying outrageous things. Apparently, this video had been batting around for a while, but on the eve of a CPAC, where he was supposed to give a keynote speech, the invitation was withdrawn. He was made, totally persona non grata in the conservative movement. And he disappeared only to reemerge a few years later saying that he had converted to heterosexuality and everything is fine. But he's never achieved his former status. And so this seems not to affect any of these men at all, that something could come out about them that could turn them into the next Milo.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what's in their closets or what skeletons they have. I mean, I think in general, these folks have conducted themselves very differently than Milo. Milo, he rose to power as an internet provocateur. I mean, he was one of the key editors that was essential to the rise of Breitbart, and that on his platform on Breitbart, his big contribution was to bring the Trump message forward in 2014, 2015, 2016. He was huge in Trump's rise to power, but he was always pushing the line, both sort of publicly and apparently, in a way that was consistent with his own personal life. I don't necessarily think that's the case with the sort of suit and tie folks that we see to be generally part and parcel of like log cabin Republicans and the folks that are normally in an administration. But I take your point that one doesn't have to have necessarily a totally outrageous scandal like Milo has in order to have your career derailed, because that was the case not that long ago, right? And it wouldn't be that hard to return to a moment in time in which just by nature of your sexual life, that is now considered, past the line of respectability, and that can ruin a life and a career. I mean, we are not that far away from that being the case. They do not believe that we're ever returning to that. I mean, one of the things I found really interesting, I interviewed almost 36 gay Republicans when I was doing my book. Many of them no longer identified as gay Republicans, but particularly of those who still are involved and active, they all have this very progressive notion of history, meaning like history is a story where things get better over time. And you and I know as historians that that's not how history works. But I found it so fascinating that these political conservatives had this progressive notion of history. Like things were bad in the past, things get better over time, and they're only going to get better in the future. There is a naivete towards that they hold that I think allows them to continue to participate in this politics and say nothing bad is coming of this.
Right.
They believe gay marriage is written in stone. They believe that public attitudes towards tolerance and acceptance of homosexuality, that those numbers can't decline. I mean, they really have this sort of optimistic view that I think is truly blinding.
It's really interesting. And they also may have a very accurate sense of the capacity of the Republican Party to make things go away. And in this regard. I'm thinking about Matt Schlapp, who is married to Mercedes Schlapp, he runs the Conservative Political Action Conference and is a big mover and shaker in the MAGA movement. And he's also famous among young Republican men for not being able to keep his hands to himself. One of these things ended up in the paper where he was playing pocket hockey with a poor young man who had just been designated to drive him to his hotel. And it seems to have gone away. Similarly, the guy who was head of the Florida Republican Party and his wife, who was one of the founders of Moms for Liberty, who turned out to be swingers. And she seems to have actually quite a thing for women. That came out and then it vanished. So there does seem to be some capacity of this powerful Republican machine to bury things for the people that they choose and then let other people like Milo go swing in the breeze, as it were.
Yeah, and Milo was never a Republican. He was not an inside party player.
True.
He's a right-wing fascist internet provocateur.
Yep.
His efforts absolutely benefited the Republican Party and benefited Trump's rise, but he's not a Washington power broker. He's a media player. And so I think that's, partly there. He's also not an American. Like there's all sorts of ways I think he was easily otherized.
Right.
And I do think, again, with all those examples you cite, I just have to say again, all white gay men.
Yep.
I think privilege of race and of gender is operating enormously here when we talk about these men who've had sort of same-sex scandals. And I don't see that means there's a sort of general tolerance to sort of sexual variation here within the Republican Party, as much as there is sort of protecting of patriarchal and racist power, of these men.
Right. So let's talk about a couple of other things that play here. And listeners, we're not just talking about Scott Bessent and what's his name? Charles Moran. We're talking about the 175 people that are on Charles Moran's spreadsheet, including Rick Grinnell, who's been in the Trump circle for a long time. But there are two other things to introduce here, I think. One is the Trump administration's truly awful record on lesbian and gay rights. And let's put trans rights aside just for a second, not just in terms of civil rights and maintaining the right not to be discriminated against, which no longer exists because the Justice Department will not defend anybody who's filing such a claim. The government will not stand behind them, but also science policy, research policy. The Trump administration has defunded suicide hotlines. I mean, really, the entire infrastructure of LGBT philanthropy has been defunded by the federal government. And a lot of those conservatives were very involved in building that infrastructure. So what do I think these guys are thinking right now?
Yeah, this has been such a sort of stunning thing to watch, even as I think during the first administration, we saw all the signs of this continuing to happen. And it ties back to sort of my opening point about access to power. One of the enormous things that I noticed in the 70-year history that I was writing about, and Log Cabin Republicans is sort of the focus of the book. Log Cabin Republicans, largest, oldest gay Republican organization in the country. Over 3 to 4 decades of their history, the first 3 to 4 decades of their existence, they really existed to be the thorn in the side of the Republican Party, to call out homophobic politicians, to primary them, to work and collaborate with moderate and progressive Republicans on sort of legislative change and also cultural change within the party, to hold the party's feet to the fire. They didn't endorse presidential candidates several times in the past because folks like George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, when they ran for office, because they didn't think they were progressive enough on gay rights issues. And the enormous transformation they made in the Trump era is the one that every single other Republican organization has made and every other Republican group has made, which is to collapse into full-blown Trumpism, to abandon whatever their long-held principles were, and to collapse into a Trumpism for access to power. And so, yes, they're highly visible. Yes, they have proximity to a president in the way that they never have before. But at what cost? At no longer willing to be a voice within the party of dissent, which is what they were historically.
Right.
And so that includes not just being quiet about a lot of these issues, but in many cases, cheering them on and applauding them. And some of those fall neatly along the lines of like trans issues versus gay issues, which they see as a stark divide. But even in this last year, this first year of the administration, they are being silent about direct attacks onto the sort of gay rights that they long advocated for and the very organizations and philanthropic endeavors that they were essential to helping build. So it is an enormous about face. And I think it's all being done on the altar of power and access.
It's really interesting. Really interesting. So let's get to the trans issue, because of course it was anti-trans politics that was really at the center of the culture wars during the 2024 campaign, and anti-trans politics that was being effected at the level of the states, but has now moved to the federal government. And we're seeing a lot of things replicated in the federal government that had already been done in Florida and Texas. We're also seeing things that Trump said he would do and did in the first administration, kicking transgender people out of the military. How does this actually benefit conservative gays to have trans people as this, and really trans women as this kind of counterpoint to them?
Well, I think, it's a complicated situation, and it's one that's, I think, changed a lot even a couple of years. Log Cabin Republicans, for example, will tell you that it is a LGBT Republican organization. They have trans members, although not a lot. They have supported trans candidates for office. They were big backers of, the Supreme Court decision that extended employment protections to trans persons. And they distinguish those sort of distinct things from what they call the radical gender ideology being forced on the nation by woke political activists. And I think, how does this benefit them? Well, it allows them to stay within the center of power in conservative media and also within the Trump administration. I think maybe a lot of watchers would be surprised how many gay Republicans, particularly how many gay men, are constant figures on Fox News.
Right.
So again, their identity doesn't matter, but they're always on Fox News with a chyron underneath them, like identifying them as a gay Republican. And what are they on there to talk about? Overwhelmingly to oppose the trans agenda, to oppose the radical LGBTQ gender ideology being forced on our nation's children. That's how it benefits them, is they get to continue to participate and have visibility and have access to power. For me, of course, the question is, but for how long? But it seems to be that they think that this is actually a really smart strategy to separate themselves from that and to drive a wedge or to draw a clear line between sort of them as gay individuals and this like radical LGBTQ political.
Well, it's interesting because the other thing I was thinking about is like, what are the stakes here? And one of the stakes seems to me to also be masculinity. And, there was a long period in which scientists theorized that gay men and lesbians actually had medical aspects of the other gender embedded in them. And they didn't mean that they were intersex, but rather that they had they weren't good representations of their gender. And really, even today, one sort of core precept of homophobia, specifically in relation to gay men, is that they're not masculine enough, that they are womanly in some way, that the things that they do sexually are womanly in some way. So, and, it's in the very recent past, even oral sex between a man and a woman was seen as kind of humiliating to men on some level. So one of the things I wonder is whether the sort of MAGA defense of gender as an absolute and as something that can be owned and that you can be proud of is also served by the anti-trans agenda.
Absolutely. And I think that gay Republicans, first of all, they have a long history with this really interesting question of sort of gender and of masculinity. I would say like all gay persons do or all queer persons do. And there's a long history there with these ideas, these notions, these performances. But, gay Republicans through the years put so much attention into really adhering to strict gender presentation. So women were were very feminine. The few women that were involved in gay Republican clubs talked about always wearing dresses and wearing pearls and makeup. The men really emphasized their masculinity and their appearance, like in jeans and cowboy boots and suits and ties. And that's something they sort of thought was fundamental to being treated as the same, as being included. And you can understand that calculation. But I think particularly this overemphasis on the gender binary in this moment and sort of strict gender roles is one in which these gay conservatives have really attached themselves to. And, Andrew Sullivan is really interesting here. He's obviously not a gay, or he doesn't identify as a Republican, but as, a gay conservative, one of our sort of leading, a prominent thinker of the last couple of decades, particularly around so many of these issues. And, he has really made this argument over and over again that homosexuality itself is at threat by this radical gender ideology that seeks to destroy the gender binary. That homosexuality, this is his argument, that homosexuality is premised on recognizing that men are men and women are women, and that he as a gay man should only wants to be sexually attracted to other biological men. And that all of that desire, that identity, that category of being is under threat by a radical ideology that seeks to eradicate gender. That's sort of a fascinating notion in itself. But the fact that his audience for that are things like the Megyn Kelly show and sort of suburban Republicans, right? That like, oh my gosh, I may not be able to be gay anymore if the trans agenda overtakes all of us.
Yeah.
A lot of things are at work in that sort of political stew.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Neil. So before we leave this topic, I want to also ask, where are the lesbians? I was able to come up with one lesbian in the Trump administration. Her name is Tammy Bruce. Like many people in the Trump administration, she is a former Fox News host.
Of course.
Who is now Deputy UN Ambassador. I now feel like I could do anything. Like all of these people just like go from the makeup room at the studio to the UN. So she's a Deputy UN Ambassador. She's been out for about 20 years. And then there's this other woman who popped into the news this week, a woman named Jillian Michaels, who was on The View. And she is a fitness instructor. She was one of the hosts on The Biggest Loser and apparently was accused of fat shaming people. But it also made me think that there may be more lesbians in the MAGA and wellness space that we know who are beginning to sort of slide over into Trumpism through motherhood, through, attachment to wellness culture. But why aren't we seeing them show up in the policy sector?
Yeah, I think that's really smart. That the MAGA/wellness realm is where we might see sort of more visibility and more names. I would also add Barry Weiss to the mix, as the editor of the Free Press and sort of, I don't know how she would describe herself, but like the heterodox sort of free thinker. But yeah, in the policy realm and the organizational realm, this is an ongoing history of hardly any lesbians participating. This was one of the things I got from an early reader of my manuscript. Where are the lesbians? And I thought, oh my goodness, where are they? I'm going to go back into the archives. I'm going to find them. I'm going to make them much more bigger players in this story. And it turns out there were none to be made, right? There were literally a handful of them and they're mentioned in the book. But what I realized was this, again, was an overwhelmingly, at the organizational level, and also at the political level in DC, it was overwhelmingly a story of white gay men. And that so many women didn't join the organization because they thought that they were so sexist as organizations. And the men didn't want them there. They were really demeaning to them. They only gave them sort of secretarial work. And also because they didn't fully align with their politics. They really believed, the lesbian Republicans through the years really believed that gay Republicans should be firmly pro-choice as a fully libertarian politics of bodily autonomy, personal individual freedom, and gay Republican men were not willing to go there. So that was sort of a stumbling block constantly towards their participation. But I also think this gets back to like the very gendered politics and culture of this Trump administration. Who does Trump want around him? He wants really, really femmy, blonde Fox News types. And so is there a place for lesbian Republicans at the policy and sort of at the administrative level in this White House? It doesn't seem so, but I think you're really smart to pinpoint this like enormous and growing world of MAGA sort of wellness culture in which we might see those sorts of folks have more prominence and visibility.
And it's interesting, as you were talking, one of the things I was thinking was, is it possible to see lesbians doing well as a group in any space that is devoid of feminism? And, it is not impossible to see gay men doing well in spaces where gay men have always done well, which is finance and the law and politics and so on. As long as they were able to play the game or willing to play the game, they've always done well because, as you have said several times, white men, white men, white men. Whereas white women, for all that they're privileged with their whiteness, are not privileged through femininity in these circles. And so it's really difficult to see any space that doesn't have feminism, as I said, as a space where lesbians could really connect to other people or be taken seriously. So, Neil, I think we're going to be coming back to this again and again because this is one of our happy places. But let's go on to what we want to go viral this week. What do you want to go viral this week?
All right, turning the page a little bit. I love this piece in The Atlantic by Megan Francis. It's titled How Parents Hijacked the College Dorm. Subtitled, The Spaces Were Once Furnished by Scrappy Kids, Then the Adults Entered the Room. And it's just about how like the decorating of college dorms has become like kind of crazy.
Yep.
And just have become this like full scale production. And there's this like wild statistic that I just think we all should hear. This year, the National Retail Federation projects that American families will spend $12.8 billion on college residence furnishings, up from a projected $6.7 billion in 2019. So like almost doubling in just, what is that, 6 years? So it's a long piece about just how like college dorm furnishings and just decoration has just gone over the top. And she really attributes this trend to two big developments or two factors, which I think won't be surprising to anyone listening. One is social media, right? Like everything is being broadcast onto these social media spaces. And also like all these ideas are being gathered of like, this is what people are doing at the University of Alabama. So this is what has to be done everywhere else. There's just that sort of arms race that happens via social media, which we know is just sort of, I don't know, a factor that can be used to explain everything. And also like these rise of these enormous Facebook groups called things like Dorm Room Mamas and Dorms on a Dime, where this is just becoming like full scale. And the second thing is, which I also think people won't be surprised by, is just like that generational nature of the parent-child relationship of like, that was sort of, I think, hypercharged by our COVID moment in which parents have become even more involved than they were just, a generation or two in sort of every aspect of their children's life, and the sort of the ongoing adolescence of young people into this college period that used to mark a real point of transition, right? Like literally not that long ago, people were like dropped off on the sidewalk, and the station wagon was unloaded and like, best of luck to you.
Right.
And like parents are like moving into college towns and spending like days and days getting these places set up and all that. Social media, like parent-child relationship, those sorts of things weren't necessarily surprising to me. The thing that I think this piece doesn't, it barely mentions it in just sort of this slight comment at the end of the piece, but I think is at the heart of this is like gender. This is not true across the board. This is overwhelmingly a phenomenon of girls and of daughters going off to college. And that was very starkly apparent to me in the last couple of weeks as I was watching on my own social media feeds on Facebook, on Instagram, watching friends take their daughters to college, and the picture of the coordinated bedroom with everything matching between the
little
two
twinkle lights and
amazing. And like, I should say my own niece is included in this, who I say all this with affection. This is not a critique of any of this. Like, I love seeing my nieces beautifully matched really gorgeous dorm room that she'd decorated with her roommate, and like everything is coordinated. And then you see the pictures from my friends who are dropping their sons off at college.
All of whom desperately need a haircut. And
Yes. And also there's literally a sad blue bedspread on the board and one poster taped to the wall.
yes,
And I mean, it was just hilarious seeing that back and forth between something that looked like it was at a like decorator's showroom and like something that looked like just a step up from like a prison cell.
yeah.
And so this is highly gendered. It really needed a gender analysis of this, and particularly the ways in which social media and that parent-child relationship are understood through a gendered lens. I would have loved that to the piece. But anyway, go check out the piece. It's in The Atlantic. We'll link to it.
You know, I would have loved to have that too, because one of the things that was so interesting to me about this, Neil, is the stark contrast between this article and the numerous articles, not just about how unbelievably unaffordable college is. It's like it's totally unaffordable, and yet we're spending another $10,000 to decorate. But also all the concern about why boys aren't going to college. And one of the things that I was seeing here, exactly as you did, was this celebration. It's like they're having another bat mitzvah for the young woman. Like this is a celebration on a scale of the quinceañera to mark her transition into adulthood, except she's not really going to be an adult because her mother's going to call her 89 times a day.
Yeah.
And whereas, how do we celebrate a boy leaving home? And that I really do think if we are concerned about boys, if we're concerned about how boys fit into our society, feel loved, are aspirational, people need to think a little harder about what they're lavishing on their girls and pay attention to what the boys might need about some kind of acknowledgement that they're special and moving on. Of course, all the gay boys, I'm sure, are on all of those Facebook sites and so on. And the other thing I wanted to suggest is, for years, you have been able to go into Bed Bath & Beyond and put together a dorm room and have it delivered to a Bed Bath & Beyond near your college, right? I mean, there were years in which you couldn't go near Bed Bath & Beyond during move-in for NYU or the New School. And so there is a certain kind of marketing and capacity to deliver things. I'm not sure that will so much be the case in the next couple of years with all of Trump's tariffs. It'll be very interesting to see how Trump administration policies impact this kind of consumerism. So I have a slightly different thing that I'm going to be talking about, which is this wonderful book. It's called Tony at Random. And it is by Dana A. Williams, who is a professor at Howard University. And it is a wonderful book about Toni Morrison's years as an editor at Random House. It is somewhat biographical. It is somewhat of a literary study. But what it really illuminates is this moment when Morrison is establishing herself both as a power player in the commercial editorial world and as a leading novelist, and how those two things are sort of feeding into each other. As an editor, she leveraged her growing power in mainstream publishing to elevate Black authors and let people at Random House know there is a Black audience out there that you're not selling books to, and we need Black books for them. But also to be the person who said, okay, in the absence of a large list of Black books, what do we need to have? And she decides things like you need, well-known figures like Huey Newton and Angela Davis and so on. And she ushers Angela Davis's autobiography, which Davis writes at the age of 26 after having gotten out of prison for being involved with the Black Panthers. She ushers that through to becoming a bestseller. But she's also very interested in what does a Black literature look like? And so she puts together an anthology of African literature, right? And to say, actually, there's a past that we're connected to. We're not all embedded in the white literary tradition. She connects with Toni Cade Bambara. They become great friends and republishes a book that Bambara had published with a very small press called The Black Woman, which is really like the breakthrough anthology of Black feminist writing. So really what Morrison is doing is reinventing Black literature. It's a really well-written book. You'll just sort of speed through it. I've read 150 pages in about 4 hours. It's so much fun and so many familiar figures that you'll run into. What I would also say is it's really kind of the next step in what a lot of African American scholars have done, feminist scholars, to examine what a Black women's intellectual history would look like. And of course, there was a wonderful book years ago toward a Black feminist intellectual tradition. Barbara Savage was one of the editors. Farrah Griffin was one of the editors. There were two more. I don't know why I'm blanking on them, but I'll include it in the show notes. And I highly, highly recommend this book about Toni Morrison. It shows you a Toni Morrison really that everybody has overlooked, and it will inspire you to go back to some of her earliest writings, The Bluest Eye and Sula.
I want to read this book so much. My good friend, Martha Southgate, the novelist, she actually wrote the glowing review in the New York Times of this book, which people should read that as well because it's a beautiful piece of writing. But Toni Morrison, Beloved is my favorite novel. And I'm a huge Toni Morrison fan. So it's also, I think what this book is doing is like people are, I think, very familiar with obviously her contribution to literature as a novelist, but this also just at the same time, she was also this incredibly important literary editor. It's wonderful that this story is being told now. And I know that book has gotten just rave reviews everywhere.
Right. Well, and one of the points Williams makes also is that by being an editor, Morrison became a better writer. And by being a writer, she was able to help people who had been so marginalized by the literary establishment learn certain kinds of conventions to get their work to the audience. But I think, one of the reasons I wanted to pick it up was my friend Barbara Savage had recommended it and said it was wonderful. The other reason is this is also a moment in which commercial publishers like Random House are publishing books by white feminists. And they suddenly discover with women's liberation, there's this huge audience of white women readers for serious books. Well, simultaneously, you've got Toni Morrison saying to Random House, there is a national audience of Black people waiting for these books. And she's very explicit about it. You can sell books. You are in the business of selling books, and you have not tapped into this market. So anyway, I'm enjoying it enormously. And yes, read it as soon as you can, Neil. So that's it for this week. And we'll be back next week, probably not talking about gay Republicans, but you never know, do you, Neil? And that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, and to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free or support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. This podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers to Political Junkie. This is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is by Cast of Characters. You can find their work on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.